When Ninoy Aquino returned to the Philippines from 3 years of exile in the United States in 1983, he did so in part on the advice of Senator Soc Rodrigo, who told him he was needed back in the country to lead, and I quote, the Democratic Center. This anecdote struck me, mainly because it made me wonder, where is the Democratic Center in Philippine politics today? Does it still matter? In the context of a definite rightward shift under Rodrigo Duterte and the ongoing rehabilitation of the Marcos name, what is the role of the Democratic Center, whatever and wherever it is? Good evening. I'm John Nery, and you are in the Public Square. Tonight, we begin a 3-episode search for the center, and I thought it would be best if we had the explainer himself in the search party. Manuel L. Quezon III is, of course, a historian, columnist, and explainer-in-chief who has written insightfully on the political center. He has also served previous administrations, notably as the man President Noynoy Aquino learned to depend on and called gravitas. Thank you, Manolo, for joining us in the Public Square.
Thanks for having me, John.
Can we begin with Ferdinand Marcos, the father? When he imposed martial law in 1972, he still sought to describe his autagolpe as a revolution from the center. Why did he do that?
He did that because he was following a model that was described and first implemented by Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon came into power on one assumption, that there was something that he called the silent majority, which was that the majority of the American people were freaked out and resentful of the reforms that had taken place in the 1960s. On one part, the elimination of barriers based on race. And on the other hand, what Lyndon Johnson, his predecessor, called the Great Society, the fight against poverty and basically to expand social justice. That this freaked out a middle class and that you could harness the resentments and fears of that middle class to create a new political coalition. Ferdinand Marcos, don't forget, remember when Marcos was doing this, he was copying that from Richard Nixon.
That's right.
And they were following a lot of the innovations in politics. Now, Marcos himself found that he could appeal to his generation. He was, by that time, middle-aged. He was the wartime generation. They were young men during World War II who were now parents and grandparents at the time of the first quarter storm, freaked out by their hippie children, freaked out by the sexual revolution, freaked out by new ideologies, and that therefore he felt that he could offer order and stability if people were give up the things that they were getting a bit fed up with anyway. Riots in the streets, protests in front of Congress, and so on. So that was what Marcos, that was the deal that Marcos offered, not only the wider public, in particular the middle class, but also his political peers, his fellow politicians. We forget that Marcos, part of the Marcos myth is that he sprang martial law and emerged from it a fully fledged dictator. He did it. He did it in stages, and along each step of the way, he had his political colleagues going along with what he was proposing at the time, thinking that they had a part to play with it. There's a wonderful line in Raisa Robles's story of martial law, where Cornelio Villarreal, who had been the speaker at the time of martial law, 5 years after martial law, went up to Marcos in a party and said, we thought it was only going to last a couple of weeks, and now it's been years. That's how he slowly played it out. And it wasn't until 1983 that you could say that he lost or started to lose that big political center.
But that was part of the appeal to the so-called silent majority, which he borrowed from Nixon, right? I mean, From the start, he enjoyed the support of businessmen, some of the religious, precisely because he sold it as a centrist initiative. I mean, the imposition of martial law. And maybe part of the appeal was it's going to be temporary.
Yes, not only that, but okay, so this helps us to start describing what is that center that he was pitching. It's easiest to understand it on the part of the left, that it is not the left, because the left's ultimate aim is revolution, which of course frightens anyone who has property or status. On the other hand, on the right, it's described by military rule, in which case civilians have no say and civilians have no defense. And so the center that Marcos was describing was we civilians, we middle class, and to a certain extent you upper class, who we also needed, but would be put in their place, relatively speaking. This is where he's being a product of UP, which is a different kind of elite. It is the elite of merit, and not a hereditary elite, so to speak, which you could say characterized the other schools. So this is what the center that he was describing.
You've described the center also, I think, in that piece that you wrote on Kidlat Tahimik as the middle path between Marcos's constitutional authoritarianism on the right and a Maoist revolution on the left. 2 points. First point, listening to you describe the way Marcos saw the center, are we saying that the center eventually abandoned Marcos after 1983?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can say that up to 1981, the center was firmly with Marcos. And this is something that even those who later on tried to take credit for the fall of Marcos tried to fudge over, because it shows you how late in the game so many people were with him. And the peak of it sort of is that inauguration of his and his proclamation of a new republic in 1981. And then it starts to implode in 1983. And it shows you also that what can be a center today can shift. It can sort of drift to the left or drift to the right, depending on circumstances. As Marcos's regime sort of started to implode, because at the very end, at the very core of it is a big question mark. If you are a dictator, you cannot tolerate any successors, which means the succession is a big question mark, which defeats the whole appeal of your rule, which is order, certainty, and predictability. So then it starts pushing people to extremes. Some will start, to look for a more extreme right solution, which is the appeal of Ram at that time, or to the left, which is away from the formal institutions and to what became known as the Parliament of the Streets. And then after 1986, you have the same question: what would be the center? The center would be the preservation and defense of the very imperfect democracy that we created in 1986 to 87, because the extremes were still worse. We weren't prepared to trust our presidents after 1987 with more power, but neither were we willing to experiment with any radical changes to the system. So it got sort of frozen in time, and that in itself came to be considered, in my opinion, unhealthily as the defense of democracy, because we stopped evolving. And then it started pushing people again to different extremes.
A second point about this idea of the center as the middle path, which you wrote about. You wrote the central core of that middle path was that change should come through peaceful means.
Yes.
This defining element, does this apply only to the Philippine experience of the political center?
I believe it's what all centers have in common. It's that reformist streak. I mean, there have been many political scientists who say that there are two sort of contending tendencies or points of view in our politics. One is the reformist one, and that goes all the way back to Rizal, that you have to do change in small or even big peaceful increments, because otherwise people and things can get out of control and then everyone suffers. Or the populist one, which is that there is a majority that is being taken advantage of and needs tough measures to put other groups that are taking advantage of them in their place. And in many ways, the linchpin, or the one that decides which one is going to prevail, is the middle class. When the middle class feels that its ability to move forward because of merit, its ability to preserve the little that it has is under threat, it can become more radicalized, either in defense of everyone as a whole, which means a certain amount of sacrifice for themselves. You could say that's going to the left, because it's really for the greater number. Or it can shift to the right because it feels embattled and it feels threatened. President Duterte, for example, the core of his appeal, again, was very similar to Marcos's, which is you now have, you can afford a car, but there's traffic. You can afford a home and have gadgets, but there's theft on the streets and drugs in your neighborhoods. And then it becomes, give me the means to liquidate people on your behalf, which was in many ways similar to Marcos's social contract at his time.
The appeal of nonviolence, which is key to the support of the middle classes, makes you think that, at least in this particular sense, People Power 1986 would then be the high point of the history of the center in the Philippines. What are the pros and cons of looking at Philippine history through the prism of People Power in 1986?
Well, I think it's problematic to view People Power as the high point. Because of what happened next. We can understand, for example, EDSA dos, because it was the result of a whole generation of kids being raised to view EDSA as the high point. So that when when push came to shove, the kids came out into the streets in many ways because they wanted to have their own EDSA, because that seemed to be the triumph of what being a Filipino was about. But it was stillborn, because EDSA has to result in a changing of the system, but it was maneuvered to sort of put the genie back in the bottle by preserving the system that we had. In which case, it became a bit hollow. And then it was followed by what some call EDSA tres, which freaked out the whole EDSA constituency, because here was an even greater number. Here was a real people power, you could argue, but it didn't subscribe to the rules of people power. It became violent. It became unmanageable. It had to be put down by force. And that, in my opinion, really put an end to people power. The sort of consensus, even though no one expressed it in words, was that we cannot risk the parliament of the streets anymore. It's too dangerous because it's too unpredictable. The highlight, I think, of that era would have been the elections of 1992 and 1998, because somehow or other, the whole goal of all of that, which was people judging administrations, people weighing in to pick administrations, and the predictable turnover in power, was achieved. In 1998, it started fragmenting because when ERAP won, it just started to unravel quickly after that. And then we started going from one extreme to the other for the next two terms after that.
The atrophy of the Democratic Center in the post-EDSA years that you've spoken of, was that because of the 1998 elections, for instance? We have a populist president elected. Or was it in fact inevitable? I mean, whether or not there was an Estrada and later on a Duterte, it would really have atrophied.
I think it's a combination of, to a certain extent, the appeal of yesterday will fade as everyone gets older, and with it, the sort of agreement that everyone made and commitment that everyone made to a system. But also, I think it was the result. The rules can affect our behavior. I'll give you an example, which is that from the very start in 1987, everyone knew that our constitution had its shortcomings, and that the system had its shortcomings. Now, any system will only remain relevant if it can adapt to circumstances and the times. We have endured the longest stretch in our history as a nation of having an unchanged rule book or operating system because of the way the Constitution was rushed and the finer points couldn't be fleshed out as much as perhaps should have been the case. Our Constitution has proved impossible to amend. And there have been, many proposals, both from selfish and disinterested corners to reform the way we do things in response to the shortcomings we see over time, but none of them can fly. And so the system just sort of keeps creaking along, unable to change, while we as a people have changed, while the politicians, as politicians, have changed, and where the interaction between all of them has changed. And yet, the operating, just imagine your computer, if it had a 30-year-old operating system without a single modification, how creaky and impossible it would be.
Does it mean that notions or if a philosophy of the center was part from the very start of our operating system, at least under the current?
Yes, very clearly. I mean, it was it's a system that is meant to take into consideration all sectors and to try to give them a voice in a manner where ideally consensus can be reached. In every measure, it's a very middle of the road liberal democratic system, ideally, that we have with many sort of innovations that were meant to learn from the past, where there were too many where it was too lopsided, let's say, in favor of those with property or those with money. But over time, but precisely because everyone working in politics is evolving, but the system itself cannot, people have found workarounds. The very best case example is how the party list has become a refuge for the unelectable, because both dynasties and other groups can infiltrate the party list, removing it from its origin, which was supposed to give a voice to the voiceless, in the halls of the powerful. But you can't change it because we can't amend our constitution, even though everyone knows it's already been hijacked in many ways.
So the operating system has not changed or kept up with the times, but other other institutions have. For instance, traditional media. You've described traditional media as the bulwark of democratic thought and behavior. Was the atrophy of the center also caused by the fragmentation of the media? and for instance, through the rise of social media?
Absolutely. It's media is only one of the institutions that not necessarily gatekeepers, but are viewed as essential allies of any democratic project. Along with the schools, there's academe, and along with academe, there are the faith-based groups, and there's civil society. All of these are, in a sense, additional groups that are supposed to have to be like-minded in their defense of pluralism, which is, let many voices be heard and let many participate in the decisions. But those assumptions aren't holding because, again, things are evolving. There was just one sort of business decision. I've always told people there was one decision made by by Globe Telecoms. Globe Telecoms decided our way to leapfrog over Smart is to offer free Facebook. And they did it, and everything changed. Politics changed, media changed, because you suddenly made something so widely available with so few controls and so quickly that those who had played traditional roles didn't even notice how things were changing. First of all, it gutted the livelihood of media, which is advertising. It also removed all filters, and therefore anyone who formerly had a very sort of minority, even crackpot view, and would have been sort of kept in that small corner to themselves, now could discover that there were millions of crackpots, and that together they could change the relationship of government to its people, and so on and so forth. And people with money realized that you could just start programming people because you had an unlimited ability to influence people on the basis of algorithms.
I wanted to get a sense of what we might mean by the political center today by pointing to maybe 5 personalities and ask you where do you think they fall in the spectrum. But before that, I want to ask a question prompted by something that you said about the Constitution, the operating system, being impossible to amend. Is that an issue that appeals to whatever the center is, or that remains a fringe issue? Charter change.
No, it's okay. So we know that there are those who are okay. Let's say for the politicians, their frustration is that elections are getting more and more expensive. It's getting harder and harder to be elected. Therefore, they want to abolish national elections, because if you just had parliamentary elections, it would be so much cheaper and easier, and they just decide it among themselves. Beautiful. On the other hand, the public doesn't want to let go of one of the real powers it has, which is to pick the one who runs the country. Now, the long and short of it is, as anyone who wants to change things discovers that you cannot change things according to the democratic way, it will start pushing people to extreme solutions, towards coups. We had 20 years of coup attempts because of this, towards looking for strong men, because if you can't get the system to change, you might as well someone to force it through by sheer force of will or by gunpowder. Or it pushes people to formerly unattractive solutions that are violent, which is maybe we do need a radical, violent revolution because people don't even know what's good for them, So that's what I mean. So it has very little to do with whether the public itself wants change. The public, I think most people involved in politics have realized the public wants inconveniences to go, but only to the extent that it does not inconvenience the public. And so that is sort of the strange parameters that everyone works with. That was the appeal of Duterte, which is, don't worry about it, I'll do it. And it's the frank appeal of President Marcos Jr. in his inaugural address. He said, don't worry about it. Go on with your lives. I'll do everything, and trust me. And that is now sort of the consensus that everyone works with. So my argument is that because of frustrations with the system, what used to be a sort of whole center has in large part shifted to the right, while still significant chunk of it has shifted to the left. What used to be firmly the center is now either stretched or less significant than before.
Thank you. I was also struck by that note in the inaugural address of President Marcos Jr. It was you might say, the antithesis of the JFK appeal, right? It's not ask what your country can do, ask not what you can do for your country, right? He was saying, just go on with your lives, I'll take care of things, right? I thought that was very interesting. Anyway, maybe we can have a better gauge of where this center is, if it still exists in the Philippines, by discussing the positioning of the following personalities. So Senator Risa Ontiveros is a social democrat. She belongs to the Akbayan Party, so left of center. But she's also one of the most productive senators in her first 6 years when she was part of a very small minority. She authored many bills that became law. Is that what we would understand by someone who is in the center? Someone who can get things done?
Yes, and I would say she belongs to the old center. That she is still part of the line from the 1980s. In fact, a product of the debates of that era.
That's right.
So she is, and yet she has more than others, and I guess uniquely, been able to project herself so that she appeals to enough of even the new middle to succeed in getting elected, where others have failed.
That's interesting. How about Stella Kimbo? So the Marikina representative, especially in her first term, enjoyed a progressive reputation. I had also a chance to take part in a forum with her. But in her second term, I think she's starting to define herself as a defender of some controversial Marcos Jr. Decisions, for instance, the Maharlika Investment Fund, and now Vice President Sara Duterte's confidential funds. So obviously someone who is very competent, she knows her economics, but now seems to be defending controversial issues. Would she be in the center?
She is in the new Marcos Center, or you could say the restored center that Marcos Senior and now Junior represents. One that is more inclined to invest authority and even trust in those in power, instead of the more adversarial attitude that we expected since the anti-Marcos era. Because very clearly she has political antennas that tell her this is what her constituents in Marikina expect, and what probably would make her viable nationally sooner rather than later. So it's very clearly that in her estimation, that is the majority inclination, and she's giving voice to that.
Let's talk about another proud product of the UP School of Economics, former Finance Undersecretary Shello Magno. I don't know much about her background. I know that she voted for another presidential candidate, but she joined the Marcos administration because that's what graduates of the UP do, I think. But when she criticized the price ceiling on rice through a Facebook post, she said that she knew she was going to be asked to leave once she posted that graph on Facebook. This person who did not vote for Marcos but joined the Marcos administration out of an ideal of public service, is she part of the old center or the new center or another kind of center? Or is she part of the
I
center
think
at all?
she, I think she is actually demonstrating millennial behavior because although I think, from my understanding, she's actually part of our generation. She's Gen X. But what I mean is, so her behavior, her service in academe, and her initial acceptance of a job in the government fulfilled the traditional expectations and role of UP, which is what the French would call to produce the state nobility. You know, the mandarins who run the technical side of government. But she also demonstrated a very unique sort of concern for her personal worth that flies in the face of both academia and government, which is that if you were going to have a different view from the administration you serve, you resign and then you make noise. Or you write an internal memo, and if it's ignored, then you can either decide to put up and shut up or leave. But you don't do what she did. I think that breaks many sort of informal rules. You don't sort of throw a grenade out there and just wait to be arrested afterwards. It was I think a disservice to Secretary Diokno. I'm no fan of his, but it was a disservice to him, and of course it was a provocation that no administration could ignore. So in that case, I don't know if it even has anything to do with the center, and more with how we are now focused on our own sort of emotional gratification and less on belonging to the whole.
How about Edcel Lagman? Edcel has been around for a long time. Became prominent especially during the first attempt to impeach Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. He essentially stopped that initiative to what he called his set of prejudicial questions. But over the years, he's moved from power to lack of power. Now he's president of the Liberal Party. Is he in the center?
He is that portion of the political class that is trademarked the maverick, who has enough street smarts and actual smarts to matter out of all proportion to the vote basket that he represents, and who plays an important role in our political culture, precisely because for all our herd mentality tendencies as a people, we do like to pick wild cards who stir up the pot, because in the end, it's what keeps things from being too comfortable for any single group. And that's sort of a strange sort of chaotic streak in us as a political society that I think is rather healthy. So that's the role he played, and it's the one that he played even when they were part of the reaffirm and rejectionist split in the monolithic left 30 years ago.
Last but certainly not least, and I think you already said something earlier about him, President Marcos Jr. Is he the new center?
Yes, he is, and very interestingly so. And I think this is shown by the very public quarreling that happens between him and his sister. I think a large part of it is not even about politics and its simple, strange family dynamics. But yes, I mean, I guess by temperament, he is more of a happy-go-lucky, easygoing person. So he's not particularly ambitious in a sort of institutional sense. He had ambitions to regain power and their standing, and make things beneficial again. But on the other hand, he has shown very little inclination to tear up the system and replace it with something else. He's in many ways, a person who has been, you could argue, co-opted by the EDSA system, because he's presiding over it and with little inclination to really take it to any real extreme. I mean, he's in many ways less extreme than his predecessor, for example. He is much more inclined to just go with the flow. And he has just a few ideas that matter to him. But he represents the shift towards the right of our center, just as a similar shift to the right has happened all over the world in places that used to have a very vigorous and much more liberal with a small L center. And for many reasons similar to the 1970s, which is between globalization and technology and changes in sex and society. There are a lot of freaked out people in the middle who have shifted to the right out of panic, anxiety, bewilderment, and resentment. And there are always leaders who will be willing to capitalize on this.
As people say these days, this is the plot twist, right? I mean, I agree with you that Marcos Jr. Is a product of the EDSA system. I don't think he would have become president in the old order. I don't think he would have risen to the top of the Nacionalista Party or the KBL. But under the operating system of EDSA, I think that's that possibilities opened for him. Just a couple more questions, Manolo. This has been a really interesting discussion. For democracy in the Philippines to become broader based and more participative, but also more sustainable and more aligned with the public's highest interest, is a political or a democratic center necessary? Or am I making the wrong assumptions about participation and public interest being equivalent to the political center?
The whole question is what was the center about in that? What made it attractive and made people commit to it? I think both the attraction and the commitment, we have to ask if it's still there. I think the glue that made it possible in the past is missing, and that glue is composed of institutions that used to matter and form the mental framework and the emotional framework that led to this investment of time, energy, and commitment. Churches are weaker. The schools are weaker. Associations, clubs, and that sort of thing are weaker. We are now basically sort of dots running around that can be pushed and collated by, probing and pushing us in terms of social media algorithms, because collectively we are herds. Now, the reality is really very discouraging. I honestly think that even the traditional politicians are freaked out and alarmed by what the country has become. We have moved around so much that the means the traditional politicians used to use to basically create constituencies that would vote them and their children and their grandchildren into office don't work. If you're a new migrant to a city, you don't care about the family that has been pouring resources into it. In fact, the only resource you might care about is being paid for your vote, because also you no longer have that civic sense and commitment to a larger, I'm part of this show that's called Proyecto Pilipino, because the whole idea of nationhood is a collective project. I don't know how many people still believe that they are part of that project and are and should therefore invest or can invest in it. With this being the case, what really is there to drive us? What drives us is old habits and lingering sort of muscle memory. We have a tendency to really dislike people who take advantage and are brazen about it. We have an instinct that it's better to be heard than silenced. We have an instinct that, at the very least, every few years, we can go and fill out a ballot and the results will be reflected in whoever is sitting in public office. But beyond that, who is to say that the democracy that Marcos Jr. is presiding over is not the authentic face and desire of who the Filipino people are and what they want? It's certainly been arrived at systematically and scientifically, whether for ulterior motives or not. I mean, that goes without saying that is a possibility that is also impossible to figure out because none of us is a mind reader. But at the end of the day, I do think a new civic sense will have to emerge. I think the pandemic showed that it can and will happen as a necessity, that there is still a reservoir of caring about others to the extent that we're willing to sacrifice. Mm-hmm. It's not all about selfishness. And that's the limit on the pre-programming or the programming that the political experts can do. It's also the way that institutions, imperfect as they are still valid. I mean, look at this thing that happened just the other day where the military picks up activists, and I don't think the majority actually has much of an understanding of activists. They have an instinctive fear of them. And yet, the system somehow threw them up so that they survived being picked up to the extent that they could, tell the public about what happened to them. And the institutions ended up cowed and looking foolish. I think that's nothing more than the inability of a fragmenting system to really become hardened. And that's remarkable. I think that shows you that one way or another, it's giving a little room for evolution. And that is what we have to see play out.
Yes, I agree with you. That was a remarkable turn of events. Last question, Manolo. In the search for the political center, where do we start looking for it? By looking for that civic sense?
Yes, looking for that civic sense. I think it's based on a solemn reflection on two questions. If you believe in democracy and you have a candidate you thoroughly despise getting one of the highest majorities in our entire electoral history, what does that say about you that you can't accept the results? Second of all, if your reaction to defeat, on the other hand, for your candidate, was to say, I am not going to have anything to do with the people because they made a stupid and corrupt choice, what does that say about your commitment to democracy and the democracy you want, that you're willing to turn your back on them, even, and this is the condition that many people point out, even if a calamity happens? Until and unless we confront those two questions, then even talking about democracy, I think, becomes problematic. Because are we really committed to a democracy, and do we even belong to a center? Have we not shifted to an extreme in the same manner that we notice and we condemn others for shifting to an opposite extreme?
Thank you. How interesting that this whole search for the political center might just end up coming back to us, asking ourselves, what does that say about us? Manuel L. Quezon III, thank you very much. What an illuminating conversation. You truly are the explainer. Again, many thanks.
Thank you.
That's it for us tonight, but the search for the Democratic Center continues in the next 2 weeks. As always, the next step for engaged citizens is to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy. See you in the public square. This is John Nery. Thank you and good night.